Now, what Africa needs, among other things, is a good educational system, properly financed. That is from preschool up to university. I'm saying properly financed, so that you have the requisite teachers, the requisite laboratories, the requisite whatever else. And Africa needs more factories, so that we're able to process the things that we're digging out of the mines, so that indeed we cease to be this exporter of raw materials. Now, for that you need, for instance, smelters. Now, smelters are very expensive things to run from the point of view of energy. They require a lot of electricity. So when I'm saying that you need all of these factories and all of those smelters, etc., you need also to have ensured that you've got a strong enough capacity to generate the energy that is required. You need roads and rail and that kind of infrastructure. If you look at, take a comparative study of what the South African ports charge in terms of movement of goods in and out of the South African ports, you would see that they are much, much more expensive than, for instance, you would take Singapore. That has an impact on your capacity to grow and develop the economy. What is it that we need to do to reduce the cost of movement of goods and in and out? I'm saying there are many things of this kind that you need to do in order to develop the continent, so that we reduce unemployment, so that we reduce poverty, we reduce the levels of underdevelopment. Now, our colleagues will see that the one was asking this question, how do we expect the West that it can help Africa to develop? That there are such parts of the Sustainable Development Goals which address this issue of the need for higher rates of growth, higher rates of development, not just growth, better shared wealth, less inequality, all of those things. Now, as you will have seen, the things I'm talking about, I'm saying better financed education, investment in new factories and infrastructure and so on. All of these things need investment. That means capital. Where is it going to come from? That's an objective reality. You can't build a factory without capital, without investment. A new factory means investment. A new university means investment. Now, if you take South Africa, you know very well that here in this country, we don't save enough to be able to generate the levels of investment that this economy needs. We don't. So, if we talk about reducing levels of unemployment, creating new jobs, and financing higher education, free higher education, and all that, we must also answer the question, where's the money going to come from? You see, sometimes I have very good dreams. You know, when Vice Chancellor dream, you know, of a new city that is born, which is brand new factories, huge employment of people, and everybody happy. The problem is that the dream does not build that new city. So when the question is raised, how come we expect the West to help Africa to develop? That's related to the question, where else is the capital going to come from to develop us? We don't have it. It's not enough. And I think there was even an addition of China to this equation. So rather than pose the question to me, we should answer this question. Where do we generate the capital to ensure that we are able to develop? And one of the things which is said is that one of the things we need to do is to address a particular relationship with regard to finances between, I think it said, 14 Francophone African countries and France. And he's right. He's right, because you've got a whole number of African countries which bank their foreign reserves in Paris. And in order to access money which is their money, they borrow it and are charged interest rates. So those are resources, capital resources, investment money, which exactly we need on our continent in order to be able to develop the continent. But we ourselves are exporting it to France and only access it by way of loans. That's one answer to the question, what do we do to generate the capital that we need? That's one answer, but it's an important part of an answer to that question. You will know we also did a report on the matter about illicit financial flows of huge volumes of capital which leave the continent illicitly. And in that report we gave a figure of $50 billion a year. The later estimates actually put it at 80 billion. Of resources that leave the continent where they should have remained, and would have had a major impact in terms of supplying us with the capital that we need. I'm saying that's another question. That another intervention which would help us to address the matter, where do we get this capital? Somebody mentioned here in passing the Marshall Plan, which was money the Americans made available at the end of the Second World War to develop these countries of Western Europe. The Americans had similar relations with Japan at the end of the war. They had similar relations with South Korea at the end of the war. You had certain relations, and for instance, with Taiwan. You had certain relations later between Japan and the Southeast Asian nations, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. I'm sure you'd have seen Angela Merkel was in Washington recently. And one of the things she said publicly was to thank the United States for what it did in terms of the Marshall Plan to help to redevelop Germany. So I'm mentioning this because I think there's something that we should not accept, at least I don't, which is the notion that it is wrong to expect the flow of capital flows from the richer to the poor, that this thing is wrong. It's a wrong thesis. If you look at the development of West Europe at the end of the World War, there were huge capital flows from America to Europe, as with Japan, as with South Korea, as with Taiwan. Of course, what drove that, those major capital flows from the rich to the poor, was what was called the containment of communism. To rescue, to make sure that the West European countries don't fall under the influence of the Soviet Union, make sure you develop them. Korea, same. Japan, same. Taiwan, same. And Southeast Asia, next, same. It was a political decision. But they understood that development depended on the movement of large volumes of capital from the rich to the poor. Same thing is required on this continent, of Africa. Africa is not going to develop by cutting itself off from the rest of the world. It can't. We produce gold. We can't eat it. We got to sell it to somebody else who needs it. An international relationship is unavoidable for us as a continent. So the question is, how do we answer that question? What is it that we need to do in order to intervene in a manner which succeeds in drawing these large volumes of capital that we need? And so the point that was raised, I thought by the last person there, that part of what we need to do is to respect ourselves. To take decisions, to define for ourselves what kind of future do we want, and to respect those decisions. Because we can't disrespect ourselves and expect the rest of the world to respect us. And this is very correct. So that's part of the response we must have. I must not be too long about this. You know, when we worked on NEPAD, we then said to the developed countries, the G8 that was mentioned earlier, we said to them, look, this is Africa's conception of how Africa must develop. Now, we want you people to redesign your system of cooperation with the rest of the continent to be consistent with this African vision of Africa. So they agreed and drafted what was called the G8 Africa Action Plan. So they looked at our plan and they said the Africans want to do this, they want to do this, want to do the other. Okay, how do we come into this? Hence this G8 Africa Action Plan. That was in 2002 when they adopted the G8 Africa Action Plan. 10 years later, by 2012, it had died. It had ceased to exist. Nobody abolished it. But gradually it ceased to exist. And the reason it ceased to exist was because these Western countries could see that they had committed themselves to certain issues here which were going to weaken their position with regard to the African continent and strengthen the continent. And therefore it withered away, the G8 Africa Action Plan. In good measure, because of our weakness as Africans. That we didn't stand up to defend this. So this matter was agreed, and as a mutually responsible system of accounting, you can't walk away. But we allowed it to wither away. This is to exist, but that's our weakness. And I'm saying those are some of the things that we must address in terms of addressing this. So we as Africans, to solve our own problems, we must engage Morocco. So that's the argument. that was used, and indeed Morocco was admitted. Now, before we came here, this afternoon, I was reading the latest resolution of the African Union Peace and Security Council on the matter of Western Sahara. I'm sure Professor Gumede, you can circulate that thing among yourselves. It's a very, very interesting resolution because it confirms the positions that the African Union, the OAU before the African Union, and the African Union have taken on the issue of Western Sahara. That the people of Western Sahara must have the right to hold a referendum to define their status. That therefore the Security Council of the UN must do this, the AU must do the other, and so on, to respect this decision. Now this decision was taken yesterday by the African Union Peace and Security Council, which says, therefore the African Union has not said, as was suggested by somebody, has not said, let Morocco come back in order that we can forget about the problem of Western Sahara. Yesterday, the African Union takes the decision that we are not changing our position and we are insisting on the implementation of decisions that were taken by the OAU and the AU. And indeed, the same resolution regrets that the representatives of Morocco who were asked to participate in the meeting to discuss this thing actually boycotted the meeting. But I'm saying the important thing about it is that, contrary to what has been suggested, the African Union has not abandoned its positions on Western Sahara. And I should like to say the second point with regard to that is that Morocco itself could not insist that we will only come into the African Union if the African Union de-recognizes Western Sahara. So you have Western Sahara as a member, full member of the AU. You have Morocco as a full member. And they work like that. So it may very well be that what was suggested, that it would be better to have Morocco inside to speed up the matter of the resolution of the conflict in Western Sahara. It may very well be that might be proved to be correct. But as of now, the position that the AU has taken is that it must respect the earlier decisions which recognize the independence of Western Sahara. Bruce, I think that's all. Thanks.